Hello and welcome to a lock-in at the Crowbar. This week we're talking about Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. It's a genre smooshing film from directorial duo Daniels, the exact genres of which are smooshed therein, perhaps even constitute a spoiler? Answering that question, and probably several others, with me, Marsh Davis, tonight is Jamie Britton.
Hello.
And Chris Thurston.
Hello.
Jamie, what's this film then, eh?
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot, this movie. I think someone actually on the Discord mentioned that it might be an interesting topic, and I'd been sort of meaning to see it anyway, so I thought it would be a good subject for us to talk about. It is... I managed to go in with very few expectations. I'd seen the trailer, which I'd kind of, it kind of dazzled me in its own way, but I didn't really know anything about the movie going in. And then I watched it yesterday and I was absolutely blown away by it. I think it's superb. One of the best movies I've seen this year. I just thought it would be good food to chat about. I don't know what your guys' expectations was about it before seeing.
Yeah, likewise. I had no idea really what it was about. I knew it had Michelle Yeoh in it and I had a vague sense of its mood based on posters and glimpses of it that I had seen, but I really didn't know what genres it was going to combine at all. And it was absolutely delightful. I think that lack of knowledge going in was quite key for me in enjoying it the way I did. So we should probably say big spoiler wall
coming fairly soon. Yeah,
indeed.
Chris,
how about you?
I went in knowing almost nothing. I saw it in this. It's out on streaming now, I believe, which is how both of you have seen it. Is that correct?
Indeed.
Yes. I saw it in the cinema a couple of weeks ago, and absolutely loved it. I actually knew very little. I knew I had seen some stills and some posters, but I hadn't seen the trailer. Kind of as soon as because I picked up a lot of buzz when it was released in the US, in the way that a lot of A24 movies seem to kind of find their way between territories at their own pace. There was a bit of a delay, but I was looking to avoid spoilers. And I think more than any other film that I've been sort of part of discussing since we've been doing these sorts of lock-ins, this is the one where I genuinely don't know what to put before that barrier. So I appreciate this is going to be a short experience for those of you who are curious about the film, because really all I'd received was people on Twitter saying some fairly hyperbolic things, I think, best film I've ever seen kind of type thing. But that was enough to make me go see it. And I was so glad that I knew almost nothing about it. I think what I will say, it's always, the interesting thing about how I would sell someone on this is it has been a really, really long time since I've been really surprised by a cinema experience. Really been taken along on a roller coaster by a film, and sort of that has felt in a way that kind of combines obviously the storytelling aspect and also the cinematic aspect of it in a really long time. I think about experiences that I've had. There are some experiences that I've had historically that I would compare this to, but doing so is one of those spoilers I'm talking about. So something that, it's just been a really long time since I've seen a film and walked out of it being like, yeah, I have very few notes. That was just a fucking great use of my time. Think about things like how I felt walking out of Mad Max Fury Road, a film this is nothing like, so I feel safe talking about it. But walking out with that feeling of holy shit, this is going to be something I remember for a really long time, which doesn't happen very often at all, I find.
Yes, I would. One of the movies I would compare it to, without a spoiler, in comparison, is Whiplash. I similarly walked out of that movie being like, wow, oh my gosh, that was a whole thing that happened there, and it kind of a totally unique experience.
It's a film that will make you say, good Lord, films. And that's the vaguest praise I can give. What a medium.
Yes.
Well, do you guys want to blast through the spoiler wall now and give us your sort of general appraisal of the film, spoilers and all? Is that a good idea?
We can do, yeah. I'd be interested to know how both of you would sort of recommend it to people, if there's any additional kind of ammo we can load into that particular thing before we fully
Well, one thing I think
splurge.
one thing I think I would say is that because of the stuff A24 have done before, and because of the way it was marketed and things like that, I was expecting perhaps something a bit more experimental or a bit more dreamy, or something with less coherence to it. And what I would say is actually it's not that at all. You could sort of take your mum to this movie, you could take your grandparents even, because it's really robust storytelling, I think. And I don't think that's a spoiler to say that. I think it's a more solid and human movie than you might think from some of the materials that have been put out for it. And that's what kind of took me by surprise, is that it has a real kind of heart to it, and a real heart and soul. It's not Fury Road is an amazing movie, but it is an exercise in muscle and cinematic kind of virtuosity. And this is as well, but it kind of has a different vibe to it too. So yeah, I would say that it's a very well put together movie. It's not an art house movie, really.
Yeah, I agree. Although I also think Fury Road has a lot of heart for a movie about screaming and cars. But we're not talking about Fury Road. We're talking about Everything Everywhere All at Once. I feel like I've got to tee us up for some sort of wall break here.
Boom. That's all gone.
Wow.
It's slightly spoilery. I can tell you how I pitched it to my friend Tom. I said, it's like what if The Matrix 4 wasn't an absolute bag of gannets, which I think is probably an assessment of The Matrix 4, which you don't agree with, but nonetheless.
Is that because you had to listen to 3.5 hours of us getting increasingly drunk and incoherent talking about it?
I will say this. All right, we've broken through the wall now, and we've said the M word I was going to say earlier, all right? And I think one of the really funny and important things to note about this movie is that it is most like seeing The Matrix for the first time of any film I've probably seen in a really long time, that at least sort of lives up to that. And I admire to a huge degree this film's absolute aversion to saying the word Matrix. I think it is an actual act of heroism on their part to just ignore it. I love that for it. And I also would agree that this is a much easier film to like than The Matrix 4. And I don't disagree, Marsh, in some ways. I love that film, but it's such an uncomfortable watch at times. And I think the reason we were able to kind of tie ourselves in knots for 3 hours, kind of articulating the complicated pleasure of that film, is the sort of half disaster, half triumph kind of nature of it. Whereas I do think this is a much more, despite being a completely bonkers film, a much more consistent achievement, to put it that way.
Oh yeah, which is a kind of crazy thing for it to be, because it is just this mishmash of so many different genres. I mean, even second to second, it is intentionally quite tonally jarring. That manages to mesh, a persistent lack of self-seriousness with what is actually quite a serious and very sincere message, which is unusual. I recognize that not all of it lands perfectly, and that I know a lot of critics, at least the more snooty ones, have come away from it saying that ultimately it delivers quite a sentimental message. But I found just the pace of it, the sort of intentional flippancy of it, particularly the puerility of it, all combines to give it this incredibly sort of giddy energy, which I found very hard to fault or dislike at all. And it's weird that because of that sort of lack of seriousness, it manages to be more serious.
Yeah, it's amazing that a movie which has extended sequences of people with hot dogs for fingers is somehow much less silly than The Matrix Resurrections.
Well, I'd like to start with the sausages. I know that comes some way into the film, but just to go back to that, the whole sappiness, perhaps, of its overall message or the ending, was made just so much more palatable to me by its juxtaposition with that puerility, and the moment that really unlocked it for me and the entire film, I think, was the introduction of that sausage finger universe, which as an idea in itself isn't actually terribly funny to me, but the way it was delivered with Michelle Yeoh's just surprised and disgust when somebody comes up behind her and gently sort of flops the sausage fingers over her shoulder. And then the Bollywood movie on the TV with the lovers' wiener fingers being slathered in mustard and ketchup. And then cutting back to the other universe where Michelle Yeoh suddenly can't open a door and is just like flopping her hands helplessly all over it. I was genuinely in tears, like just loads of tears of laughter, and it just got me. And then once I started laughing, I could barely stop, because I was then caught back in this feedback loop with where my partner was looking at me with kind of mild consternation that I was like having some sort of medical malfunction. And then, you know, having got to that point of, you know, laughing till I cried, I was just emotionally unlocked at that point, and I was able to accept the film's other sentiment with a lot less cynicism that I might have otherwise normally mustered.
Oh, tremendous. So I was going to say, because I agree, at the moment with the film, it was very close to the moment that got me in the cinema as well. Like, there was a moment that like broke my friend Will, who I saw it with, and that was a different moment, which I'll get to. The moment that broke me was like the last normal fingered monkey being beaten to death by its sausage fingered companion in that redo of the start of 2001. But I do feel like, so something I'm really aware of like 12 minutes into this episode is I suspect there are going to be some people who followed us through the spoiler wall because they genuinely don't have an intent to see this film and are happy to hear us talk about it. And so I do want to back up a little bit and kind of give them an overview of what the fuck it is we're talking about when we talk about a sausage universe. If that seems reasonable. Like, not a full recap, because I think that's a bit too much, but like to actually talk about what genre this film is and what story it is telling, to the extent that you can kind of summarize it, just so that we can contextualize those moments a little bit. Does that seem fair?
Absolutely, yeah.
So I suppose that, you know, this sort of it's a film that starts life as a sort of slice of life comedy about a family, a Chinese Canadian family running a laundrette, and then quickly becomes a sort of kind of multiverse hopping in its own way, sci-fi action movie. In the manner of The Matrix, in the same manner of someone discovering that reality has far more layers than perhaps they are aware of, and they can tap into this, and that they themselves have a great destiny. It's very Matrix. But what it revolves around is not that conflict necessarily, but it sort of uses that as the stage with which to kind of continually orbit and reassess and return to and reframe the central drama of that family in increasingly ludicrous ways. But where the kind of the multiverse hopping conceit is effectively a way to kind of build and build and build the stakes and the silliness of what is ultimately a generational conflict, a family conflict, and a personal conflict about what one's life is worth and what one should do with one's time. Basically, it was interesting to see it. The Matrix is the huge comparison that it really fits into, because so much so that it has a kind of in its kind of initial kind of like almost mythical antagonist, Jobu Tupaki, a kind of Agent Smith style, you know, unstoppable force that can take over bodies, can adopt any kind of multiversal guise it wants in pursuit of its goals that no one can stop. It has a plucky band of rebels from the Ultraverse who use cool chairs to beam special abilities into people's brains with which to fight this force, right? Like, all of these things are very, very similar, but all of that is in service of that kind of the relationships that are established in like the first 5 minutes of the film, basically, in the end. And I thought it was really effective at that, because in a way its refusal to let the universe of the emotional core of the story gets bigger means that the way in which the actual multiverse gets bigger and bigger and sillier and more surprising over the course of the film. I think that's what helps it retain its humanity, and it's also what makes that stuff feel so fun and kind of I'm trying to think. I don't mean permissible in this context, but it means that like the breadth of those kind of multiversal experiences, including the sausage universe, are ultimately all part of kind of like the weave of just these people's lives in a way. if that makes sense, and how kind of silly and daft and slapstick and gross and sad and tragic and glamorous and things people's individual lives can be, and it is sentimental, but I don't rue that about it. And the further comparison I would make, including to the Matrix Resurrections, is that the Matrix is also a super sentimental series, and ended in that way, right? The kind of like, if anything, Matrix 4 is just doubling down of like, this film's about love, you assholes. It's not about cool flips, and that's why we're not going to do one.
I mean, I would agree that it is very much a movie that builds. It has a kind of built-in redundancy to its plot, a sort of built-in redundancy against squiffiness or plot holes or sentimentality. Actually, it's very the setup of it couldn't be more simple, really, in a funny kind of way. In that, as you say, you have a chosen one and a big bad, and realizing that your fate and the fate of the universe are one and the same, and you've got to rescue it and all that sort of stuff. That's all fairly standard. But what it does, and the way that the movie is orchestrated and set up, and the way that the plot moves through it, is all this kind of rather marvelous way of giving the audience permission to have fun with what's going on without worrying about logic too much, or worrying about who's doing what at what time, because actually it's very legible. It's a very clear film in many ways, and what it does is give you excuses to enjoy it more, and that's what I think is the genius of it, sort of above everything else, really, in that it wants you to have fun, it wants you to enjoy how playful it is, and it doesn't want you to sort of feel any anxiety about the concepts that it's introducing, because the joy in the movie is inside the sort of moments. It's a movie about the infinite nature of reality, amongst other things, and it wants you to kind of rejoice in how much it can pack into those spaces, into one moment across many realities. The movie is basically set in one or two locations, really, but it finds, well, it is more than that, but like primarily we're in a couple of places, and the movie, again, it kind of rejoices in finding infinite variation in that, and inviting the audience in to experience the kind of the joy of that experience. And I think that's really clever.
It's something I agree, and I think something that plays off that really well is like, I love its core mechanic, like, not to use game dev terms too much, but like one of its core conceits is, in order to kind of leap your brain across the multiverse to access the memories of another version of you who may have been like an expert gymnast or a kung fu fighter, or great at some skill or another, in order to gain access to their memories and skills, you just need to do something extremely unlikely. And the exact nature of the extremely unlikely thing, which almost come across as like game show, like, penalty challenges, basically. Like, it almost creates this sort of like icebreaker thing where, like, initially it's very odd the first time it happens, and then when you get the logic of it, it is almost, I think, to the point you're making, Jamie, almost like that kind of permission to have fun thing.
Yes, I mean, you don't want to think about it too much either. Like, it's
right.
I mean, it's very much there as a vehicle for some great gags. There are ways in which, as a sci-fi conceit, it is not consistent, actually. But if you ask that question, then you're denying yourself the vision of a stuntman in slow motion butt slamming his way onto a pint-sized cone of sex rubber. And why would you deny yourself that image? That stuntman also gets thrashed unconscious with a pair of dildos, incidentally. Is a guy called Brian Lee, who I can only imagine from what he signed off on to do in this film is either a tremendously good sport or deeply hated by the filmmakers, and we may never know which.
There's a moment, because I think it is that thing, is like, if you have that anxiety of like, oh, this premise might get a bit weird, the film kind of just screams too late at you, and it's like already off on its way. Like, there's a moment where they are trapped in the secret sex office of the man who runs the DMV. And that Michelle Yeoh finds by accessing like the memory of her own life when she was a cleaner of the DMV instead, and witnessed him having like a tryst and emerging from his like BDSM cave. And and she's getting ready to fight all of the kind of assembled kind of agents of Jobu Tupaki who are outside waiting for her. And it really is like, it's not the first significant kind of action sequence, but I think it's the first, like, it's the first full, what I would call like Michelle Yeoh kind of like full on amazing bit of fight choreography sequence where she's like fighting with a riot shield at one point and doing so while holding her breath because the room's filling with gas. But there's this one shot which was actually the other moment that killed me, where it cuts to like the kind of assembled crowd of, you know, antagonists in this case waiting to kind of confront her. And in any other film, this is the Matrix moment of like all the guards lining up in the lobby, right? Like guns leveled and something about to happen, like the starting gun on this action sequence is about to be fired. And they all have to then, but it cuts to them doing all of the different, completely different things that each of them is evidently needs to do to access the version of themselves who's good at fighting. And and there's lots of good visual gags in that shot, but in the background of that scene is a man passionately fucking a lamp, and that image is completely seared into my brain. Like, I don't know of that entire scene because I just caught him in the background because you see everyone else and I can't even now remember the much more visible silly things that are happening in that scene. All I can remember is lamp humping man. And it's such a delight in that moment. I think partly because I think, to repeat Jamie's phrase, like it is an invitation to have fun. It's also like something I like getting a sense of in films, which is like, it looks like a project that was very fun to make as well. That like there's a real sense of warmth, not just in the characters and how they relate to one another, but in the production, which is hard to achieve. Like there's a playfulness to the production that I find kind of comforting as a viewer, which is a phenomenon you don't always encounter.
Yeah, it's interesting that it like you say, it is an invitation to have fun, and yet the beginning of the film is, I found, incredibly stressful because it doesn't begin with this otherworldly conceit. It begins with what is, you know, close to being kitchen sink drama bureaucracy nightmare, in which it really conjures the sense of just being overwhelmed by just a huge number of mundane stress factors. The principal among which is taxes. Which is, you know, a phrase which should probably come with a trigger warning, genuinely, and then you know you're thankful as soon as the destruction of the multiverse hoves into view, because everything suddenly becomes a lot less stressful, which is probably not the way it should work. But honestly, you know, if that's what it takes to get me out of dealing with Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, then cool, go for it. Bagel me, bro.
Yeah,
I think you're right.
It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? Because what the movie then sets out to do is kind of show you all those elements from different angles. You know, the character played by Jamie Lee Curtis, who's the kind of IRS inspector from hell. We get opportunities to sort of, you know, and her being the sort of, you know, personification of impersonal bureaucracy that's out to ruin your life with a tick of a pen. You know, we get to see her from, you know, every conceivable angle. You know, it takes this world and shatters it into pieces through its sort of subjective, you know, psychedelic dreamscape, and that's just so joyful. I think again, it's another way that the movie sets things up and then knocks them down very. With a really clear idea of what it's trying to do at sort of every given moment. The jokes of the movie, I think, are a really good way of looking at that, because, you know, another movie, they might have a gag in it and then they kind of, that's gone, you know, like that was a funny moment. Let's move on, you know, let's move on to the next thing. But it has a really robust attitude to callbacks and also setting things off to pay them off later. It has so much patience with those things, and it's so rewarding. Like, I would take as an example one of my favorite elements of the movie, which is the Rakakuni character, which I think is one of my favorite things I've ever seen in a movie. That she introduces this as a mangling of obviously Ratatouille, and then the moment, and then later on in the movie, you see she's a teppanyaki chef and in another universe, and there's another guy who's really, really good, and she's jealous of him. And then further down the line, she goes into the kitchen to see a raccoon sitting on his head, controlling his hands. And then the raccoon takes control of him and tries to kill her because she's seen too much. And that's only like halfway down that particular
The
rabbit hole.
Raccoon arc, yeah.
It
Yeah.
keeps going and it keeps paying off. And every time that fucking raccoon was on screen, I was just dying. It was just so funny. And it keeps going. It's that kind of, it's almost like there's plenty of amazing action in this movie. But I always, the best action set pieces in movies, like the dry river scene in Terminator 2, or I always think of the scene with the running sequence in The Incredibles, or they're movies where they like amp up the tension again and again and again. We're going to bring in more to this. And it felt like that with this movie, and I've never quite experienced something like that, where the gags are kind of, sort of multiplying themselves by the power of infinity again and again and again. And I just thought that was amazing.
It is really that sort of like, it's a great example, actually, thinking about that. I hadn't thought of it in these terms of that kind of, I'm usually not given to laws in these things, but that kind of law of escalation in comedy, right? The kind of 1, 3, 1,000 thing, where it's funny, something's funny the first time, it's funny the third time, and it's funny the nth time, where n is just too much, right? Like there's a moment where excess itself becomes funny. I think the Rakakuni thing is a perfect example of that, because the first time she mangles the Rakakuni thing, when she's trying to explain what's happening to her skeptical family, and she says it's like that film, and if you're me in the cinema at that moment, you're waiting for her to say The Matrix, and she says Ratatouille, and that's very funny because that's just a very good joke, because she doesn't say Ratatouille, but to the point she says Rakakuni, but she's trying to, that's even better, she's trying to say Ratatouille and she's failing, and like making the point that Ratatouille and The Matrix are kind of the same film is an incredible observation. I mean, like they're not, but at the same time, that's independently very funny. And then when it escalates to the point of, and then when you realize later in the film that maybe she said Rakakuni because she's already started contacting her multiversal selves. And so she's forgotten that in that universe it's called Ratatouille instead. And that she's sort of already stepped sideways. Like it's rewarding on the second go. But then that kind of process by which you kind of almost let that one slide for a while. It comes back a few times as Rakakuni, and it's funny. And then it escalates to, it's actually Rakakuni. Like you watch the first time you see that teppanyaki chef, who is amazing at it, you can see the raccoon tail hanging out the back of his hat. You don't notice it the first time you watch the film, but there it is. Like it's like it's all right, and it's this sort of building and nesting of it, and the commitment to the bit is really extraordinary. And I think it's one of those things that you sort of like, even as the film starts to wrap up and it's in its big ending, the all at once bit, you become sort of equally invested in getting at least a sense of closure to this other film you've watched, Rakakuni. The sense that you're given a fairly good reliance that they do rescue the raccoon in the end, like, which isn't even a B plot at this point. It's like a kind of, delta plot on some different dimension.
Did you see, incidentally, who voices the raccoon? Did you see who that was?
I did not.
Randy Newman does the voice of the raccoon.
What?
Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
The fact that all of those jokes climax at the same time and get closure at the same time. I mean, obviously, that's why it's called All at Once, I guess. But I mean, it is an incredibly elegant piece of writing to have executed that, even, a third as good as they ended up doing. Because, like you say, I was invested. I was invested in Rakakuni. I was invested in what happens to those rocks, strangely.
Yeah, the bit where the rocks fall off a cliff is genuinely like that bit. Like, so we shift to like we're just watching some rocks and some text on the screen for a bit, which started to make me laugh because it's like the film is. It should be a fuck you to the audience in most contexts, and we can talk about things like the fake ending as well, and that, like the way it literally speaks to cinema audiences at various points. But like, it should be a fuck you, but it's so warm and silly that you're almost end up in this game of chicken with the film. Like, how long are you going to keep this going? Like, how long can you possibly keep two rocks talking to each other in an infinite world when no life never developed going? And I find that stuff very, very funny. And because at that point also the film is like earned my trust that like, okay, you're going to do whatever the hell you want and I'm just going to kind of enjoy it. I think it's a really effective a really effective thing to achieve. What I would also say is, I think, just to kind of something that keeps occurring to me is like, I do think some of the moments of genuine sentiment land far more because the film is so exhaustingly strange the rest of the time. Like, it's a lovely line. I've seen it quoted a lot, but the line, where sort of successful businessman Waymond from the universe where he and Evelyn don't get together, and she ends up a successful movie star, an action star, and he ends up successful, and he says to her, I might have liked to just do taxes and laundry with you, which is such a sweet bit of kind of like romantic writing. But it really landed for me for several reasons. But one of them is like everything outside of the little bubble of their relationship in that moment is so mental that is actually, almost tapped into my own nostalgia for the start of the film, where I had some sense of which way up was. And I think it's a really effective way of like regrounding the movie emotionally by using all of that chaos, like sausage fingered dimensions and raccoons.
But then it also helps that section has, I mean, it's a nod to In the Mood for Love, I think, but it brings with it such a clear aesthetic that is so different from the rest of the film that it immediately roots you in the exact mood that is required to understand those words as the kind of emotional heart of the film.
It's funny. It's funny that whenever you're watching basically any Christopher Nolan movie, right, and then the last act of the Christopher Nolan movie, he's always doing that thing where everyone's doing different stuff. Oh, we've all got different things to do, and we all need to execute them at the right moment. Otherwise, the world will end. He does it in every movie, and it's never as clever as he thinks it is, because there's always our protagonist, who sometimes is literally called that, and then a bunch of other people doing stuff. Oh, here's what Tom Hiddleston's doing. Here's what this guy's doing, and you never really care about any of those guys. They're basically just red shirts, right? You're basically just waiting for Leonardo DiCaprio or whatever to do the thing that's going to end the movie, which has already been going on far too long, right? But it's it's astounding in this movie that they have, like, they have that same thing going on, basically a confluence of different things happening at once, all landing on the same moment, and it is infinitely more thrilling, and you care about every single one of them. You even care about like sign twirling Evelyn. It's like it's such a bit of magic to do that, to have so many different moments land all at the same time, all at once. The fact that case in point, the sausage fingers thing, it ends up being like this really sensitive, like lesbian affair.
How did they manage to recuperate that moment from the almost outrageous silliness the film could have possibly thrown at the camera to being...
You get very good at doing things with your feet. Like, that should be...
Oh, the feet is so good. The feet is so good. She's playing the piano, like Fleur de Lis on the piano with her feet. It's just so good. Claire de Lune, sorry, not Fleur de Lis.
But then it also, I mean, it not only kind of... I mean, it completely rehabilitates Jamie Lee Curtis's character. Yeah, I mean, it's such an important moment for her story, and the fact that it solves so many problems that they get this character on side. But it's insane to think that they gave that moment to the sausage finger universe. And yeah, it completely works. I found it really, when during one of the sort of spasms that Michelle Yeoh undergoes as she moves between universes, she obviously offends Deirdre in that universe where they have a relationship, and Deirdre doesn't understand and breaks down. And like Jamie Lee Curtis back turned to the camera, sobbing inconsolably. It doesn't matter that she has sausage fingers. It's incredibly powerful.
I think that's the thing that is sort of because at that moment it's daring you to kind of push through the visible silliness of it to care, right? And I think that's quite an effective way of connecting you ultimately to the characters. Like, I think the Nolan comparison had not occurred to me, and I think it is dead on. Because I think in some ways this is like the film that like Tenet wishes it could have been. I don't know if you both saw Tenet, but I thought it is similar in that it has a sci-fi high concept about how the universe works, whose logic it it wants to respect deeply, but then it has no story to tell with that, really, outside of a few set pieces that are kind of cool. And I think part of the reason for that is the relationships in it are pretty cold and largely symbolic, even though they're supposed to anchor the film. They're supposed to be these sort of anchoring motivations for these various characters, and moments where, tragic, moments of people making decisions based on their relationships with one another just simply don't land because you don't give a shit, really. It has some similar logic in some ways, alongside, like, I will not allow the universe to be destroyed because my boy lives in the universe, or whatever. That's where my children live in reality. Yeah. I must protect it for that reason. That stuff.
Yeah, you're dead right. I mean, that film is designed, in a way that they are different, because I don't think Everything Everywhere All at Once is a science fiction film, even though superficially it shares quite a lot of things with science fiction films like The Matrix or indeed Tenet. But Tenet is designed as, I'm sure Nolan thinks that when he came up with it, he was like, I'll create this, intricate clockwork world where all this stuff fits together, and but actually it's just it's a clock of farts. It doesn't stay together at all if you think about it. And then once that evaporates, then you realize that cold-hearted premise was really the only thing that was interesting about the film. And like you say, it doesn't have any kind of character or heart, whereas this film is just character and heart, and it's at every moment it is willing you to forget, really, or not care about, really, the consistency or lack of in its science fiction elements.
Well, to take that analogy a little bit further, I think it's funny. This is something I've been thinking of a lot recently for other reasons, but I think I think you're right that films like Tenet imagine themselves as contraptions, right? That that all of its pieces should be like watching the pins in a safe lock click into place as someone cracks into it, right? And it should all kind of flow according to its logic. And that is a desire that I think runs through a lot of cinema. There's a story that gets thrown around a lot in the sort of the kind of story sort of construction circles that I am running in at the moment about the probably one of the only successful examples of this I can think of, which is Alien, where the kind of the creative team's dedication to having a really firm sense of the layout of the ship and where the alien was at any given time and where it could go, and the ability for you to hypothetically make a alien's point of view version of that film that follows seamlessly alongside the other one because of its attention to detail and the underlying logic of the thing. That's very impressive, but it's not the reason it's a great film. And I think there's an attraction to logic as something that gets us out of the messy business of performance in some ways. Films as performances, even though they're these big collective ones. And my view is traditionally that all storytelling like this is kind of like a magic trick, right? There needs to be some logic or some rules that the audience invests in, but sometimes it's valid that they're invested in it simply so you can subvert it or go sideways with it. And cheating under the tablecloth is valid.
I think,
right,
and to defend
happen.
Nolan, I think that the films where he does that are the most successful. I don't think, for example, the Prestige or Inception are necessarily kind of logically pat, but they have the aesthetic of being complicated in the moment that you're watching it, and they carry you through that plot because it has this kind of desire to confuse and baffle you, and that's quite scintillating. And if you think about it too much afterwards, perhaps they fall apart, but you're not meant to think about it afterwards. You're meant to be in the cinema enjoying it. And I think this film also has it shares the success of that by being just so overstimulating. I don't think it has nearly any of the number of problems that Tenet does that it needs to cover up, but nonetheless, anything that is logically inconsistent about it, or there are some jokes that didn't quite land for me, but they're gone so quickly, and you're just bowled along with the pace of the film and the frenetic speed and the way it's shot and the just sumptuousness, the fact that every frame is filled with so many detail elements which are themselves references or jokes.
I think this is because the thing is, I do think it is a contraption, but the thing it reminds me of is, I don't know if you've ever seen those YouTube videos of old blokes who restore those completely bonkers carnival organs, the kind of Wurlitzer sort of it's a pedal organ, but at the same time there's all sorts of stops and whistles and weird little sound effects and bells and things that rattle, and you can watch these old blokes on YouTube just fucking going at it, just playing every playing a song, but pumping away at all these things like they're conducting a steam train fast forward, and it's bonkers, but it's also kind of completely entertaining, and you also end up quite impressed by the fact that these are devices that exist and were kind of created for the most overstimulating human entertainment that was probably conceivable at the time of their conception. Like musical instruments designed to make children faint, as far as I've been told.
But you're right. I mean, the contraption here is the performance. The contraption is not the universe in which this film fictionally exists.
Well, that's the thing that Christopher Nolan has done, in so many of his movies, right? He gets to the end of his movies, and there's a thing where he goes basically the plot says something like, and you know what the real fundamental subatomic particle is? That's right, love. Or, the real palindrome was friendship, or something like that. And it always does it. And it's like, no, Chris, you didn't make that movie. You made a cerebral piece of, brushed granite nonsense about nothing.
Yeah.
And you can't just put a crying Matthew McConaughey at the end of it and hope that we care. And also hope that it fills in the plot holes that you haven't bothered to, address. That is not he pulls it off in The Prestige, which is his best movie, I think, because the movie is geared around that quite literally. He tries it elsewhere and it doesn't work. Whereas in this film, to compare it, it makes its whole business, every single moment of the movie is about love and relationships and the reality of those things, and the realities of family and the realities of the difficulty of those things. It doesn't just tip it in at the end as as a little bit of, and here's a little bit of emotion to back up, this kind of knockabout farce we've had. It's made it its business from the start, and that is why it's so successful, and why it doesn't. The ending, if you'd taken out all the magic and all the crash bang wallop of this movie and just made a sort of indie film about, a sort of slightly depressed family, it would seem like a very pat observation to come to at the end, which is, you got to learn to love those you're close to, and, and all that sort of stuff. It would seem pat and oversimplistic, but it doesn't, because that's not the film they've made. They've filled every moment of the film with nuance in its own kind of weirdo way. And I've read a few of those reviews, which sort of Pete Bradshaw in The Guardian apparently completely missing the point of the movie entirely, I think, by kind of seeing it as being simplistic, but I don't think it is at all, really.
It's the moment when you realise the man playing the batshit Wurlitzer is actually playing Hallelujah.
Oh, God.
And there's a raccoon.
And he has an identical twin.
I feel like we haven't talked much in talking about kind of what the film achieves and kind of orbiting the characters themselves. We haven't actually talked very much about the characters. I think only it was sort of, I realized saying it a few minutes ago when I was talking about it, that saying Evelyn and Waymond as the main characters, we hadn't really talked about it in those terms. So I'm interested to know from both of you, what characters did you find the characterization successful? Because obviously all the actors in that film have the challenge of stretching the characterization of those people across the most bizarre reworks of those characters you can imagine, right? Particularly Stephanie Shu as Joy. And so I'm interested if that worked for you, if you end up with a consistent set of the characters, or if it was more about their kind of emblematic role in the film.
Well, I felt like Jubu Tupaki was something of a stand-in for, not necessarily even generationally linked to the Zoomer generation, but just nihilism, basically. And it is easy to be nihilistic in the face of a life where all the decisions and all the choices have gone poorly for you, as many people feel they have. And there is a suggestion in the film that we are living in the worst universe. And so I loved in her, just a side note, I loved in her costume design that she looked like she'd been dragged backwards and unconscious through Comic-Con. That was kind of her look. Well, I think that's exactly what I was going to say, is that her costume design is one of the things that sort of hangs a lampshade on the idea that she is not really so much for a person at those moments, but a, a concept, a force of nihilism. You can't take her seriously as like a well-rounded individual when she has like giant teddy bear shoulder pads, but she looks so amazing as well. Every point, God, I wish I could wear a single thing that would look like a 10% as good as she does in her costumes.
I mean, you could give it a go.
Well, I think the key to it is that is that she's sort of styling out quite literally this like deeply traumatic awareness that makes someone very lonely, right? To be aware of the sort of there being too much in the universe and being the only person aware of all of it all of the time. And like that, it does feel generational, right? Like there, to the extent that the film has, like, I think it resists pat messages, necessarily as much as it just kind of wants to orbit this family. It's interesting to me. I can't remember who said it on Twitter, but I thought it was funny. Someone said that it feels like all the millennials are growing up and making films where parents apologize. And I saw this, and I don't think that's far off the mark, actually. Like thinking about films I've seen recently, like, and there is a lot in this genre about the experience of young people being utterly overwhelming, right? And if you're going to pull a metaphor from Jobu Tupaki or Joy, I think every aspect of that tilts towards, and to the extent as well that like the multiversal awareness is expressed as almost like genre literacy or kind of like film literacy in some ways, Rakakuni. She is someone who has grown up utterly overstimulated. We've already described this as an overstimulating film. But when she kind of reintroduces herself, it is this sort of revolt of someone young, right? Like in the way she expresses herself, the pseudonym that she's given herself, the ways in which she explicitly tries to shock her mum. There's this half of it which feels like a kind of coming out, and another half that feels like a rebellion. And I find that kind of, it is affecting. And I think the kind of the reconciliation of that is hard won enough to feel earned.
Oh yeah,
because not notions of like generational kind of understanding or forgiveness can be quite hard to swallow. And I am particularly like, I tend to really dislike it when films treat that reconciliation as an inevitability. Though the stories of young people kind of feeling let down by their parents need to necessarily end in them realizing that, well, they did love you the whole time, and that being enough. And I think the film actually does a really good job, for all of its silliness and for all of the kind of like, there is a kind of cosmic silliness to Jobu Tupaki and the Everything Bagel, right? Like that her, I'm not hanging a lampshade on it. She's trying to, like, the point of that is not that she's trying to destroy the universe. She's trying to kill herself. She's trying to end herself, right? As someone who is overwhelmed by the universe. And
she's trying to get her mother to see it as well.
Yeah. And to be there with her. Right. It's really like quite heart-wrenching at its core, what she's trying to do. And the silliness of its presentation kind of dares you to dismiss it. And I think, and then almost like welcomes you to kind of see it differently. And I think the pulling her, I really like the way the film juxtaposes several different moments of a family awkwardly acknowledging one another's feelings. Like in the timeline where the kind of the party in the laundromat goes ahead, and it sort of breaks down in that awkward, horrible way that sort of families pushed to a kind of emotional breaking point do. There's some shouting and some glass gets broken, but it doesn't really go much further than that. And then the juxtaposition of that with the kind of stairway fight / sort of reconciliation sequence that ends with like granddad's mech helping pull Joy out of the huge bagel she's created to destroy herself, like that. Those things sort of being kind of, I get that people think it's sentimental, but for me, I think the kind of the layering of those things is quite moving, because what it expresses is all that kind of overstimulation is ultimately navigable, and that it is not it is not too much.
Well, it's funny that
promises to be.
that moment comes directly after this kind of the most literal interpretation of fighting fighting something with love that I've ever seen, where Michelle Yeoh fights her way up that staircase towards the bagel, using her kind of now entirely unlocked powers to sort of lovingly solve the people she's fighting's problems. So she corrects one guy's like back problems. She sprays that guy with the perfume that his wife used to wear.
Spanks another dude.
She spanks that guy, which is just incredible as well. And it's so clever because what you're about to see is the literal version of it. And he's given us like this symbolic sort of take on that idea first. And this is all towards yet another symbol, but it's the more kind of real, we're also seeing at the same moment a much more humane kind of interpretation of saving someone with love. And so again, the movie gives you so many ways to kind of take a seat and enjoy something before you think about it too much, and makes it silly but also makes it serious all at once. So that any of I said this earlier, but any of that squiffiness that you might feel or ickiness that you might feel with a scene like that has been obliterated from your brain with joy.
I don't know. I didn't feel particularly bad about this while I was watching it, but I do think maybe in retrospect that Becky is sort of shortchanged in the film. Like she seems like it's quite a key part of rehabilitating Joy is to tell her that she is loved, and to get her to recognize that not only does her mother love her, but she has her specifically her own Waymond analog in Becky, like somebody who will be with her and heal her. But we don't really get any kind of Becky time on screen apart from a few snippets of dialogue here and there. And obviously they're a cute couple, but it doesn't necessarily sell it that what they have is a universe-saving level of love and kindness between them. How did you guys feel?
I think you're right, and it's interesting to me that, like, given that I described like Joe Butupaki as this sort of like both a coming out kind of character and a rebellious character, that I actually in saying that kind of forgot to make the link to the fact that at the beginning of the film, that's what Joy's request of her mother is, to kind of support her in coming out to her grandfather, right? And that then what that kind of gives way to is this kind of like multiversal supernatural expression of that desire. But I agree with you that Becky's part in that is quite thin, actually. I think it's interesting that the film kind of orbits the fact that Waymond and Evelyn will kind of orbit one another in different universes to some extent, or their paths kind of constantly converge. The same is not necessarily true for Becky as a counterforce in her own way to Joe Butupaki, right? The relationship that matters there is Joy and her mother, and I think I don't know. I don't have an answer to it necessarily. I think you're right to call that out as a kind of a gap in the film in some ways.
Yes, I mean the movie locates Joy's trauma in various ways as being an extension of Evelyn's parenting, and I think that's probably why they focus in on that. Because she's in the initial reality, she's annihilated her mind by experimenting on her, which is very funny. We all got parents, haven't we? But
we're all given the internet too young. That's
we've absolutely.
I mean, that is what it is, right? Like it is to like, it is that Bo Burnham song, the movie, to some extent. Yeah, and it is funny as well that obviously it does establish that Evelyn herself in another universe might also herself be gay. It's just in the sausage universe.
We should talk about some of the other performances in this. I mean, for me, I think Michelle Yeoh is absolutely incredible in this movie, just in about every single direction. Things are thrown at her quite literally non-stop, and the sort of sense of, I don't know, she never makes an obvious choice in her performance. It always seems realistic. It grounds you in this insane world that's kind of happening. It never feels like she becomes a different character, even while she is, quite literally becoming different versions of herself. And I think that is an extraordinary thing to pull off. That while she's doing all this incredible kung fu and audacious kind of stunts and stuff like that, she still feels exactly like the same character you meet in the opening shot of the movie. You know, miserable and pulled in too many directions at once.
I mean, the film gives the opportunity for all these actors to show off their incredible versatility, I already know that Michelle Yeoh is a great actor, but just seeing her switch between these different kind of modes is quite astounding. Especially when I'd watch an entire film of the In the Mood for Love pastiche. I'd like to see more smoldering Michelle Yeoh and smoldering Ke Huy Quan as well, who is as Waymond is just incredible. Like I hope this reestablishes him as like a major actor, because he does so many different things in this film. And seems completely suited to each of them. Like in his role as a beta Waymond in the kind of original universe, you could not imagine him wearing black tie and pulling it off, and yet suddenly, we're in this other universe where he is just the most charismatic man smoking on a rain-swept street,
which is an absolute smoke show as well.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think he's great. Like, I feel like we kind of talked a lot talking about how, like, because he carries the burden of kind of introducing the high concept of the film in a lot of different ways, right? Like, his is the first transformation when he switches to Alpha Waymond. And, like, I think he also does an incredible job of, like, that jump is not as extreme as it might be. Because ultimately, the film, because for the reasons we already discussed, the film does a nice job of keeping the multiverse stuff kind of silly, right? The technology is kind of silly, the setup is kind of silly, and Alpha Waymond is kind of silly. But like this, there's such a nicely observed kind of shift from, what a kind of messy is as Peter Waymond to being like that transition to cool Waymond is really beautifully done, I think, because it's not this total personality shift. It's just a few degrees into driven. Really,
he's still fighting with a bum bag. He's still fighting with a bum bag, even though.
Right.
Yeah, the bit where he's trying to give himself a paper cut was agonizing.
Horrible.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, he deserves an entire career renaissance from this, and if he doesn't get one, it's absolutely criminal. What an amazing performance! And he is, that in many ways, I mean, this isn't quite right, but he's kind of the heart of the movie.
Oh yeah,
I think he is. Yeah,
but he probably is. Yeah. He probably is, in fact, and that is
kindness as the way to solve conflict is literally what fixes everything.
Yeah.
Well, it is. Bear in mind, it is ultimately like. I mean, it's funny to see like several different in recent pop cinema, several different references to like a third eye opening, and as a kind of metaphor for enlightenment. And I love the fact that in this movie, the third eye that opens for Evelyn is his, quite literally. That
right,
kind of
the googly eye.
Yeah, the googly eye. But it is. I mean, she pops in the middle of her forehead, right? Her third eye opens.
And that segues exactly from a direct reference to The Matrix, where all the bullets stop in front of her, and she just plucks one out, and it becomes the googly eye.
Yeah,
fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I thought James Hong was great as well. I think he always is. Yeah. But
I love James Hong. What a treat to get him to seeing like him wearing a mech suit.
Yeah, exactly.
I think probably like all of us, he is just someone who, whenever he turns up in movies, and he's been in a lot of movies, 93, he's been in movies for a long time. Whenever he turns up, he's always a welcome.
And always been the same age, it seems.
Always been the same age, yeah. Fantastic.
I've just noticed that Jamie Lee Curtis's character is called Deirdre Beaubeardry.
That's an excellent name. I mean, and she's another one. I mean, like I watched at least 1.5 of those new Halloween movies, right? And they are wank. They are really, really bad. And she's not bad in them, but it's just a completely unforgiving part for her to play like Laurie Strode, like alt-right survivalist Laurie Strode. And it's just like, I mean, she's not those things, but that's kind of the vibe of her. And like to see her in this, like, oh my God, it's so fun to see her like playing this like grotesque from every single angle, and then like finding the beauty within that grotesque. And just like really throwing herself into this crazy ass part, you know. And I think it's I was really surprised with how much she does with it. It's great.
Yeah.
She's a brilliant villain without really ever being a villain. Like in the earliest scenes with her, she does something against her own better judgment and gives them till the end of the day to get the proper return in. You know, she does something nice, which is a real bit of sort of rule breaking on the part of the movie. I think it undercuts itself. I think most movies would want her to be this kind of beast who is eventually slain. But they do that like pretty much straight away, and then after that, they just embrace the weirdness of her and what the sort of all the weird and wonderful things they can get her to do, which I just think is very, very brave and clever.
I really like, she's the first character in the film to kind of draw the donut. You know, when she circles the part of the.
Oh God, yeah, I hadn't noticed that. That's fantastic. Yeah,
and that sort of the repeated. It's something I just realized that's obviously the repeated the big, black everything donut of darkness is the kind of the repeated metaphor for that kind of nihilism and despair. And I've just realized that it's the inverted googly eye.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's very good.
And I was like, that's a surprisingly consistent set of metaphors. Raccoon film. We could talk a bit about the structure of the film a little bit. It's interesting, I think, because it has a couple of obviously it has a sort of main structuring device, which is divided into parts of uneven length, right? Everything, everywhere, and all at once. And then on top of that, it has several moments where it sort of almost like resets the stakes or has another go at kind of telling the story, specifically orbiting the moment where it basically fakes an ending, and then zooms out to reveal a cinema, which is one of the universes, and builds out from there towards a kind of a different ending. And it's kind of that sort of structural playfulness, I think for me at least, sits on top of the rest of the film's playfulness. Is something we haven't really dug into. I don't know if either of you have a thought on how that changes the kind of the journey of this story for the audience. Because I still agree with you, Jamie, it's quite a simple story at its heart, but those are moments where it does seem to explicitly and almost like, textually tell you we're starting again now.
Yeah, I mean, it's all texture. I mean, like you say, that the structure is a basic 3-act hero's journey, but what it does is that's the kind of base of it, and then on top of that, it's all scribbles. And as long as it's traveling in the right direction, it doesn't worry too much about an act structure. So it gives you the kind of illusion of a kind of dream logic, recursive kind of plot, without actually doing that, which is what we all do. I mean, if they talk about Rick and Morty, the filmmakers have talked about like this has been just dating for them since like 2010, and they talk about seeing Rick and Morty and kind of while they were thinking about this movie and thinking, oh fuck, that's that done. We can't do this now. And similarly with Into the Spider-Verse. And I would say that those are both properties that make huge successes out of basically fudging plot complexity. They actually do things incredibly simply, but they give the illusion of massive complexity, which in storytelling terms there's no difference really. Like if it seems like complexity, then it is complexity, But I think the fact that they and the key to unlock all that is character. If you can have a character who is going on a legible story journey throughout, then it doesn't really matter. You can do anything. And that's why I think Michelle Yeoh is so key to it, but also that, at no point in the movie was I confused as to where she was at, like at what point in her journey she was on. And that would have ruined it, I think. I remember playing the video game Crysis 2. I think it was Crysis 2, right? Where you're a man in a suit and you're going around New York City and things happen to your suit which change the plot. It change the nature of the being you are in that game, and they also are important for plot things. And there's lots of like transcendental moments where you're picked up by a beam of light and shown the face of God and stuff like that. And I remember after two of those, you don't know, which one of those was the important one, because they both felt quite significant. But actually, I don't know what this means for anything. And although it may be a weird comparison to make between Crysis 2 and this, there's several moments of transcendental flip out in this movie, yet somehow I was able to track all of them and not feel anxious that I didn't know what was going on.
I think you're absolutely right, because like that kind of zoom out to reveal that the ending was actually the ending of the film in a film, and therefore we'll continue with the film, is grounded in the fact that after that reveal and the kind of playfulness of that, the next thing you see is Evelyn, is Michelle Yeoh's face. And just in and this is testament to her performance, just in the way she is looking at the screen, it tells you that we have followed our Evelyn's perspective here, right? That we haven't left her behind. And that is such a, like, that I think is to what you're saying. It's the kind of, despite it being a film that's defined by being split over so many different universes and perspectives, you are kind of following one consistent performance throughout, which is a remarkable trick to pull off. But as I think we've said a couple of times, it leans entirely on that performance.
It shares a cinematographer with the Spider-Verse as well, incidentally. I don't know if that's important in any way. He's obviously a very good cinematographer. I think what you're talking about there is also mirrored in the complexity, but also clarity of the way it's shot.
Yeah,
and everything's always kind of very kind of plainly presented in a way, but also it's incredibly intricate, the things that are on screen. Lots of delicious sort of pivots as well, and movement within the camera. But it's all there, which in a way which accentuates what you're meant to be feeling rather than obstructs or confuses. It's a very distinctive visual style altogether, I think, actually. Like there, for an inverted commas sci-fi film, obviously there are like special effects and CG which are designed to, feel authentic in up to a sci-fi point. But also there's a lot of like effect work and prop work, which is very, very kind of intentionally stagey, like almost evoking like a handcrafted feel, like those LED covered headsets in the Alpha universe, or Gong Gong's mecha wheelchair. Or
Rakakuni himself, a puppet.
Indeed, yeah, like very obviously not a great puppet. Like they are great goofy props, and I think that's sort of like, I think that, amongst other things, is a sort of distancing technique to prevent the audience sort of getting too wrapped up in like the seriousness of the sci-fi conceit. It's like saying, no, don't worry too much about how this hangs together. There's an animatronic raccoon, so chill.
It's funny. There's that graphic novel which I just realised shares some sort of DNA with this. It's by the guy who did The Invisibles. I've forgotten his name off the top of my head. Grant Morrison's The Filth, which is similarly about an ordinary kind of, or sort of miserable old person who learns that he is in fact the member of a sort of interdimensional, detective agency who needs to go and fight like giant sperm monsters in true kind of Grant Morrison style. But it plays across that aspect of like the idea of misery leading you to sort of believe that you are the chosen one. And in Grant Morrison's version, it goes towards nihilism, right? It goes towards this idea that if you lose yourself in infinity, then you're basically, insane and you're gone forever. Whereas this movie obviously goes in completely the opposite direction. But it just struck me that, like, with what you were saying there, Marsh, that the way that the world is pictured and the way that the world is presented, there's a friendliness to it, and there's an artificiality to it, which is one of the things that stops that from happening, I think, that stops it from being a movie about losing yourself and makes it a movie about finding yourself without wanting to be too pat about it. But
can I tell the story of the extremely odd reality experience I had while watching the film Everything Everywhere All at Once in the cinema?
I think you should.
So this was maybe a little bit too far in terms of like cinema 4D, first few rows might get wet type cinema experiences where the film comes to life. But me and my pal Will went to see it at the posh local cinema with sofas. We sat down on our sofa to watch the film and realised that sat behind us and slightly to the left were two people we knew from Back in the Future days. But I say Back to the Future days, back when we worked at Future Publishing. And we turned around to say hello to them and did so, waved, but the film was starting, so it wasn't much more than that. And then we watched the film. And at the end of the film, I heard someone behind me say, "Hey, Chris, but the voice didn't sound like either of those two people. And I turned around and realized that sat behind them and slightly to the left were two other people I knew. And that at the beginning of the film, a kind of sort of strange recursive social event had occurred that I wasn't aware of at the time, where I had turned around to wave briefly at the person sat directly behind me, and in the process indirectly waved at someone sat behind them who does actually know me, but I didn't see them at the time. And then after, because because we'd been sat watching the credits for a little bit, letting the film kind of wash over us, the people that we knew had left silently, leaving a gap where that kind of first connection could be actually formally made at the end of the movie. It's only one of the weirdest kind of unpickings where that person said to me, like, I thought you saw me at the start of the film, you waved. And I was like, I wasn't waving at you, I was waving at the person directly in front of you who I also knew. And then while sat outside a pub after the film, talking about the film and trying to articulate to my friend why this was so weird, someone else I knew who knows that third person zoomed past on a scooter and waved at the exact moment I was talking about. Just so you know, reality is collapsing. That was like at midnight. Why was he on a scooter? I still don't know.
Waved with his giant sausage fingers.
But it's good. I thoroughly recommend it. It's a bit like I went to see Top Gun Maverick with my mum a few weeks ago. And if you want the real 4D cinema experience with that, just go and see that film in a cinema full of people in sort of army town adjacent Salisbury, where it's just a sea of dads whom love the jet plane, and my mother who loves jet planes more than anything, going, oof, every time a plane is loud, which is all the time.
Oh, that sounds
It does sound like the ideal experience. I'll have to hit your mum up for a ticket when I'm back in England.
Yeah, she'd go see it again in a heartbeat, I think. Loved it.
It is the sign of a great movie when you bring it out of the cinema with you and into the world. I mean, apparently for you, Chris, that worked sort of backwards in time as well.
Reality bent around.
Yes, it had to make it work. Yeah. So, but I think I think it would be impossible to walk out of Everything Everywhere All at Once and not carry it with you. It's so relentlessly joyful, top to bottom, that it just kind of, I don't know. It's
the joy is really the point, because I was kind of trying to get at when I was right at the beginning of this, when I was saying that, like, I haven't had the experience of walking out of the cinema with that feeling for such a long time. Whereas, like, it's obviously not a perfect film, but it's like, that was really special, and I feel great having seen it. There are lots of films I've seen recently that I've really enjoyed, like The Green Knight, a couple of years ago, The Lighthouse, and Parasite, where I've walked out thinking, that I had a really, really good time with that, but haven't felt kind of buoyed by it in the way that I felt buoyed by this film coming out of it. Like I'd entered into a really fun conversation with the filmmakers, whereas, like, coming out of The Lighthouse, for example, I was like, I came out feeling like I had definitely watched a man wank a seagull to death, or whatever it is that happens in that film. And I was like, that was stirring. But I'm not sure that I've been moved.
I mean, I think I agree. Not so much about the wanking. But I don't think I'm going to see it again, though. I think this might be the one and only time I see it, because I don't know. I've never seen Whiplash again. That was one of the best experiences I've ever had in a cinema. Seeing that movie completely blew my mind, and I feel like to go back to it would just detract from that, so I'm not going to. And I think I might feel the same about this movie. I think I might be done with it, because the time I spent with it was so wonderful that it feels like anything to go back to it would be to dilute it.
I think I'm not sure. I feel somewhat similarly, but I think I would go back to it in order to go through it frame by frame, because there's moments where Evelyn sort of mega jumps between 50 or 100 universes in rapid succession, and I bet every single one of those frames has a gag in it, and I'd like to freeze frame and frame advance and sort of sop up all the details, because there's so much that's just in the background of this film, which is
I wanted to see all those faces as well. You know, where you see all the sort of portraits of her flashing forwards.
Yes.
That was a wonderful sequence, and it kept going as well. To the point where you're going like, "Oh my god, the work that went into just this 30 seconds is extraordinary."
I think I would see it again with someone who hadn't seen it. Like, I would really like to have the vicarious experience of watching someone else go through it for the first time. You know, I agree kind of with Jamie. Like, I'm not, because I did think it was a pretty long film. That was maybe like, you know, it does take it felt longer than maybe it was. To me, at least the first time. I'd be curious to see if that was the effect round 2. But yeah, I would love to, you know, I get a lot out of people's vicarious, like people's enjoyment of things in the cinema. It's why I like seeing films in the cinema. And so, you know, it's the same, you know, logic by like, if a new Marvel film's out, if I'm going to see it in the cinema, I'd like to see it like night 1 in the Odeon when all the teenagers who are obsessed with it are there, because that's the most fun time to see those films. And I think this was, you know, the thing that made this for me was like me dying along with the last normal fingered monkey and my friend being completely destroyed by Rakakuni when that reveal happened.
Oh, it was Rakakuni that got your friend, yeah.
Yeah, it was Rakakuni that got him. I was also got by Lampfucker as well.
Yeah.
See, that's the freeze frame that I need to go back and properly explore.
Yeah, it's great.
The
It's
dude
great. I mean, I really have described every aspect of it, to be honest, but like, it's there.
The dude's trying to butt slam because
The
butt plugs, because they're her awards, aren't they? And she says they don't give these out for nothing. And I remember looking at those awards and I went, "Oh,
That's a butt plug.
That's a butt plug. That's going to come back later." And so I couldn't have predicted how it's just extraordinary. It was like like when a dog's trying to get persistently trying to get a crisp, and that's like the eagerness with that guy trying to get that thing on his arse was just so good. And then there's another guy who stuck something else up his arse. So what has he stuck up there? Is it a bong or something like that?
It's like a golf trophy or something. I can't remember exactly what it is. It's very good. It's very good. There's a bit where another bit in the film, an early bit of the film that got me is, and I'm pretty sure I'm remembering this right, the bum bag fight. As the bum bag fight escalates, which is the first like real action sequence in the film, I think, when Alpha Waymond kind of kicks the shit out of the DMV security guards with the IRS office security guards with the bum bag. There's a moment in it where they're starting to get their ass kicked by him, and one of them gets like, you know, twatted in the face by the bum bag, and you just hear one of the other ones say under his breath, "Oh no, Chris." And then get a bum bag in the face and go, "Fuck." And it's that little, just a little detail, but it made me chortle. I think stuff like that's why you watch it again.
There's a good moment as well when their sort of powers drop away from them and they just have a kind of slap fight with each other. When her and the guy she's fighting sort of suddenly lose their powers, and they're just sort of like two kids in a playground. It's very funny.
Yeah. Is that everything?
I think that's everything. Everything is over now.
What's left?
Just the outro. Shall I do the outro?
I guess.
You can tweet us at Crowbar. You can listen to these recordings on YouTube, where you can find other stuff by us. The address for that is youtube.com/Crowbar. Thanks as always to our backers on Patreon who do not pay for these lock-ins. They only pay for the fortnightly games podcast. But you can back us too anyway at patreon.com/Crowbar. Or you can just join our lovely Discord community, the link for which is on our website, CrowbarCrowbar.com. That's everything. I've been Marsh Davis.
I've been Jamie Britton.
I've been Chris Sesson.
Thanks
for listening, everybody.